Hello, my name is Ghanwa Hakim, and you are watching the Arabic Hour. Our program today will feature a discussion on a recent expedition to Palestine by Interfaith Peace-Builders, an independent group that works for delegation-based education and advocacy regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the United States' role in it.
Settlements were on every hilltop. The bypass roads connecting them were now like major, they were there like for all time. It was really a map of what Israel has in mind for the West Bank, and I was really shocked by that.
Today's guests, Sara Driscoll and Susan Etscovitz, members of Interfaith Peace-Builders' most recent trip, join us. An active member in Palestinian work since the first Intifada, beginning with Women in Black, Ms. Driscoll is also the co-founder of City Life, Vida Urbana. Ms. Etscovitz was a former employee of the Department of Children and Families for 35 years. After retiring, she embraced the Palestinian liberation cause and is a committed member to the organization. Joining us as an interviewer today is Dr. Nancy Murray. Dr. Murray has been an activist for peace with justice in the Middle East since 1988, when she made the first of more than a dozen visits to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Her many accomplishments include publishing the book Palestinians, Life Under Occupation, along with numerous articles on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Most recently, her work was featured in the 2013 book edited by Hani Faris, The Failure of a Two-State Solution.
This was perhaps my 13th or 14th trip to the West Bank and Gaza Strip on other occasions, but not this one. And I'm very happy to have with me here two of the delegates who accompanied me on that trip, Susan Etscovitz and Sara Driscoll. Let me just start by saying this trip, which took place in late October and early November, was a real eye-opener for me. I had last been there perhaps 3 years ago, and what I saw that has happened in those 3 years was really shocking. What I saw was that Israel's plan for Eretz Israel, Greater Israel, had really taken shape on the ground. In my first time in the West Bank, I remember back in 1988, I'd have to travel quite far to find a settlement. Now, you could look nowhere and not see a settlement. Settlements were on every hilltop. The bypass roads connecting them were now like major, they were there like for all time. They had signs demarcating, saying this way to this settlement, this way to that settlement, ignoring Palestinian villages. It was really a map of what Israel has in mind for the West Bank, and I was really shocked by that. The last 3 years, they have been incredibly busy. As we know, I think settlement expansion just in 2012 was up 70%. So that was one thing that really shocked me. Another thing was that shocked me was how Palestinian resistance is continuing under really harsh circumstances. We visited many of the villages where this resistance is happening, and we'll hear more about that from our guests. What I thought of, knowing about the civil rights movement and how when civil rights movement protesters marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge for voting rights and they were beaten back on the bridge and very grievously hurt, people like John Lewis, the current congressman, that was shown all over the United States on television and shocked the conscience of America, and people rushed down to take part in the next march. Well, just imagine if it's like a march across the Pettus Bridge has been taking place in the town of Behlin every month, well, actually every week, every Friday for 9 years. People getting met with ferocious resistance, and in this case, the world not paying very much attention. And it was shocking to me that Palestinians could sustain this, that they had the will, the determination, the courage, and the optimism that through this kind of resistance, one day the occupation would end and justice would come. So that was another real surprising thing to see, the strength of the resistance. The other thing that shocked me and caused me to feel very sad was the state of Israeli society, the fact that so few Israelis seemed to be at all interested in what was happening in their occupied territories, which they have been occupying for now almost, 46 years. really indifferent to the occupation, indifferent to the suffering, and, you know, basically living their lives in a prosperous economy thanks to our tax dollars and so on. So those were my three major impressions, and I'd like to turn now to our guests. It's an interesting to these two guests because one has been very active, this is Sara, on the Palestinian issue for many years, but this was her first visit. And Susan has not been active and had not thought much about it, and this was also her first visit. So I'd like to start there, perhaps by asking each of you. Let's start with you, Sara. You knew the issue on a sort of intellectual, at an intellectual level. How did you, what you saw, match up with what you thought you'd see?
I was equally as shocked in many ways. I had seen many films, heard many speakers, and been doing the work since the first Intifada. So, with Women in Black, etc. I recently BDS. So I expected to see poverty. I expected to see settlements and walls, but I didn't expect the extent to which I saw the walls and the settlements. And I think what you just said about every hill, and they're fortresses. They're not even pleasant places to look at, or that you would want to live, it seems. So I was shocked by that, and deeply moved by the joy and the resistance and the nature of Palestinian welcoming us, Palestinians welcoming us, both into their communities and into their homes personally, which we'll get into, I guess, later perhaps. But we did have an opportunity to spend a couple evenings, a couple overnights. So one was in Beram, actually, where that you just mentioned. So I was deeply moved and inspired, I think, are the two things by what but I was, and also my anger. I just became so angry and frustrated, but it gave me more impetus to come back and continue the activity and to talk to every American I saw, not just during sessions or something, but yes.
Susan, would you tell us something about your background and how you ended up going on this trip and what it meant to you?
My youth was spent in Long Island. I'm a Jewish person. I grew up in a conservative temple, not overly attentive to religious issues, but involved somewhat. And I also grew up believing in Israel, believing that it was the right of the Jewish people to have a homeland after the Holocaust, believing that Jewish people brought to this land beauty where there had been none. And my family contributed to planting trees in Israel. I basically bought the scenario that is pretty much afloat to this day with people like myself growing up the way I did. And I didn't realize until my cousin Jane became a Palestinian activist that there was really another side to the story. And then I met a young man whom she brought back from Palestine to live with her, Taha, who was an aspiring filmmaker and made a film about his mother selling time, going from village to village selling time. And I got to know him and talk more to her, and my feelings began to change. I was not convinced that I was going to be active in this cause, or that I even really 100% believed in the cause. But I knew I wanted to go and see for myself. And this trip with Interfaith Peace-Builders changed my entire life, I believe. I saw things that I did not expect to see. I felt sadness that I didn't expect to feel, and such a sense of betrayal by my people. of everything that I was taught to believe about who we are as a people. And it was just shocking on many levels.
Yes, I think that is the experience many people, in fact, I can't imagine people who go there and do not have that experience, because it is such an extreme situation. The occupation is so repressive. And one of the things that I was a little worried about as a co-leader of this group was, having taken lots of groups during the Intifadas, there you see the Israeli soldiers, and you know that repression will be happening all around you. And this time I thought, well, maybe it's going to be harder to convince people that the occupation exists because the soldiers aren't so visible in your face. However, our very first day, we had an experience which reminded me of the Intifadas. And perhaps, I don't know, Sara, would you like to start by describing what happened when we went to the Ida refugee camp, which is in Bethlehem?
Sure. Our first day, after we'd had one other meeting, and we go to the Ida refugee camp ready for a presentation and a tour. And we were out front of the Legi Cultural Center and just kind of getting ourselves organized, and we saw these young boys on the street tossing rocks and things. And then all of a sudden there was noticing, and just up about 2 blocks away were 3 Israeli soldiers standing with their weapons of whatever type. And so the young boys started tossing stones. Clearly it was getting nowhere near them, but being 2 blocks away. But the next thing, and I went about taking photos because there's the wonderful key at the Legi, in the camp that about the right to return, and everybody's still holding their key, and it's an incredibly beautiful symbol. And so I was taking photos, and then I took a photo of the soldiers, and not 2 seconds later, people were like, get in this building, and I got literally grabbed by one of the other delegates and yanked into the front hall. And it turns out that it was too late. We got tear gassed, and it was, along with the children and whoever, it was pretty intense amount of tear gas. And since the Vietnam War, I haven't experienced that or my demonstration. So, very intense on the throat, the eyes, and we ran upstairs to the 2nd floor and to a room that had not been bothered, so we were able to calm down.
Yeah, I think that you were caught in the middle of it.
I was shocked and tear-gassed and scared, and I was also pushed into the building by one of the last people getting off the bus, one of the leaders, and I thought I was going to die then and now. I hadn't experienced it before, although I'm surprised I hadn't, and but I did experience it then. It was horrible, and my heart felt like it was going to beat out of my chest, and it was going to be the end.
And this is the daily diet
Exactly.
for people in refugee camps. I should explain that on that particular occasion was the day that the 26 released prisoners were returning home. So there were big welcoming committees.
3 from the camp.
Yeah, Ida camp had 3 of these long-term prisoners over 20 years who were coming back, which was why the soldiers, I guess, were there, although they could be there pretty much all the time. So that really was a kind of taste of what life under occupation in terms of being face-to-face with the army.
And they did a
like.
2nd round of it, too.
As we were leaving.
Right.
And that was also the day that they announced that there would be, I believe, 1,500 new settlement units built.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, actually, the number was 20,000. 20,000 new settlement units. And then there was, and these 20,000 would basically closing up what's called E1, which is outside, on the edge of Jerusalem. It would be between Ma'ale Adumim and Jerusalem, and it would basically cut the south of the West Bank from the north of the West Bank.
Exactly.
Then Netanyahu said, well, we're going to suspend building those, but I think about 15,000 will go ahead. And it's hard to even imagine where they're going to put them. The place has been so plastered over with settlement. So, I mean, these are...
Kerry was coming to town that day.
Yeah.
Or the next day, so
Yes.
it was, let's not let these peace talks really have any content, okay?
Right. Right, which is a very common thing, that the Housing Ministry will announce some new settlement
That's right.
project when John Kerry comes to town. What did you think of, I think at Ida was your first glimpse of Israel's wall, the so-called apartheid wall or separation wall. What was your sense about that?
It's impossible to see that wall and not recognize the hostility coming from the Israelis to the Palestinians. I mean, it just represents a total division and separation and keeping people out of life's forces. I mean, it just was appalling. And it wound its way around everywhere we went. We went all over the West Bank and Israel. And
yeah, it is now, I believe, 270 miles long, which is 60% of its intended length. And as I'm sure you both know, the wall was declared illegal where it went into Palestinian territory by the International Court of Justice. But, you know, Israel just goes on building this wall. Thanks to the support we're giving it financially, the wall now costs more than $3 billion. So,
but the beauty of that was the people in Beram, because of these demonstrations and because of finally getting international support, the people of Beram, the village, actually were able to go to court and have it pushed back 100 meters. And they won that court decision, and that wall got pushed back, and it was a pretty wonderful.
And what did they tell us was on the other side of the wall? Remember, they told us the olive trees had all been destroyed.
Yes, absolutely.
And it took deaths of several people during the protests, tear gassed to death, with canister, one of them, and collapsing for the young woman who was running away and had been tear gassed repeatedly in the same session. And at a great cost, over a long time, they got this barely, a great concession in terms of what else is happening, but not much of a concession when you think about it.
And they're still doing these weekly protests because now they've built a playground where the wall used to be. And now there's a demolition order on that playground, and so they're, still
and
having
huge coils of razor wire, still blocking the land that they should have access to up to the wall, so that in fact you're not supposed to be able to get there. And in fact, I ended up showing up down in front of the wall.
Yeah, he managed to get through.
Made his way through.
Yes.
It was, and just on the other side of the wall also are all the settlements. I mean, Beram is surrounded by settlements, and the lighting is very interesting because I think that was one of the very striking things for me. The settlement lighting is all that gold lighting, yellowish gold lighting, and the village lighting is first of all, very much less lighting. Those settlements just like glow and gleam in the night. I mean, they take away all access to the sky. And the villages are all just small amounts of lights, either maybe on one or two on the street and some small lights in the houses. And they're all traditional bulbs. So it's very interesting to see that contrast.
At night. I mean, at night you're really aware of the settlements because the orange lights are.
The orange lights, and they just surround so many places where we were at night. They would be up on the hills, but we were up on hills too, so equal.
Right. Well, the story that we were told by Amal Nasser in the Tent of Nations, which is land near Bethlehem that was surrounded by 5 settlements, and the 5 settlements want the land of this family, the Nasser family. And she told us an amazing story. They have been in court for over 12 years. They have the deeds to their land going way back to the Ottoman period.
Right.
After 6 years of a court case, they were told they had to go to Istanbul and get the original documents. They've had every hurdle placed in front of them, but they continue to fight for this land. They've had their houses demolished. They now are living partly in caves.
They had a Palestinian lawyer, They had a Palestinian lawyer for, I believe, 8 years working on the situation with them, and then they were told that won't do. They have to get I believe it was an Israeli lawyer to handle the case.
But they exemplify this word samud, this sense of steadfastness, I believe. And would one of you like to talk about how Amal has made a friend in a settlement?
I would like to. She said Amal, who is the granddaughter of the original family and the sister of our guide, she told us that at a bus stop she met a woman who was obviously not Palestinian, who was Jewish, and lived in a settlement. And they got to talking, which is a pretty rare occasion, I guess. And the woman, I believe she said, was a Russian immigrant living in a settlement, brought here with full privileges and housing. And they talked to each other and exchanged, I think towards the end of their talk, exchanged phone numbers. And lo and behold, the woman from the settlement called Amal and asked if she could come to visit the settlement.
To visit the settlement, right?
I mean, to visit the Tent of Nations. I'm sorry.
Yeah. What amazed me about their interchange at the bus stop was Amal said that this woman said, "You can't live there. No people live there." And she said, "I do. That down in that little valley is where my family is always living." And the woman said, "No, we were told no people live here."
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's how she came to invite her to come, and the woman from the settlement followed up and did go to the Tent of Nations and was very impressed. It's just a wonderful group of Christians who have stayed on the land, who are educating children, people from all over, all faiths and religions. They live in caves, and they have the same water situation as most Palestinians have, which is very little water. They can't catch the rainwater, and they're only allowed a certain amount of water from the Israeli government. And the Russian woman from the settlement said, "What's going on with the water? I have all the water I need. We have a swimming pool, running water all the time." She was incredulous that this could be happening practically next door to her. So that visit was successful in terms of these two people understanding more about each other. And then the husband came back with the woman, and again they forged a relationship and bridged some gaps. And eventually this couple from the settlement had their wedding anniversary party at the Tent of Nations, which is a lovely example of...
Well, I think for me this story really resonated because this woman from Russia had no idea where she was. She didn't know this was Palestinian land they were on, and she was clearly a pawn in the game of, colonizing the land. When you said we can't catch rainwater, I mean, it's basically, you can physically catch it, but Israel has been going around, there's soldiers shooting up the cisterns, the tanks which hold rainwater, because they say the rain that falls on the land of Israel is ours. So would you like to add anything about the water situation?
Well, just you can always tell a Palestinian home from an Israeli house because the Palestinians all have to have black water tanks on top of their roofs, and people are allowed maybe 2 to 3 hours a week to have running water, and they store as much as they can, because then they go for weeks without having it, and in fact they have to pay for a full 7 days of as if they had running water coming out the tap. So they're paying these immense and horrible extra, even more than Israelis pay, for water they don't get. And The water is being stolen by the Israelis, in fact. They've already so destroyed their own aquifers in Israel itself that they are now stealing the water from the West Bank and from the aquifers there. And so I don't know, what do you say? So as Palestinians make do with what they can, and will go for days without any water. If their water tank empties, then there they are until the next time. And sometimes they can truck in some water from elsewhere, but it's an incredibly difficult
And they have to
situation.
pay a lot for that water.
Yeah, they pay a tremendous amount of money for their water.
Yeah, well, that is, I think, a problem in the rural areas because it affects, their inability to irrigate crops. It's a problem in the cities and even in East Jerusalem where we were.
Incredible.
You could see the Palestinian homes had those tanks on
Everybody.
top. Whereas they plop a very nice looking house in the middle, which is going to be a Jewish settlement, and immediately they run the
Which we
Even
saw
if
water
it's just
pipes.
one family,
Right,
one,
we saw that in
one
Jerusalem.
Jewish family, they get piped in water. Well,
Yeah.
everybody around them is
And you see an apartment building
Rationed.
with like 8 water tanks on it. I mean, imagine how much weight that has to be too. So it's extremely dangerous, all that heavy water sitting on top of your roof,
Right.
if it's full.
So we had that tour of the house demolitions and settlement expansion in East Jerusalem. We had a tour by the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions, which has been around for a number of years, highlighting the whole issue of Palestinians not being able to build without permits and having a demolition order. And then what we heard about how the demolitions were carried out, I think, was pretty shocking.
Yeah.
Do you remember they basically, after getting the demolition order, at any time within the next month, they will come and give you 5 or 10 minutes notice
At
to
any
empty your
time of
house.
the day or night, and it's mostly often very dark. I mean, in the middle of the night, 2, 3 in the morning, doesn't matter what
Get
the
out.
weather is.
Yeah.
Goodbye, get out.
Yeah.
You are watching an interview by Dr. Nancy Murray with Sara Driscoll and Susan Etscovitz regarding their recent trip to Palestine with Interfaith Peace-Builders.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Do you remember the story of the little girl that we
Yes.
were told? Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, the little girl with the
Doll.
a dollhouse, which she kept carrying to school with her and bringing home. I mean, it's a little bulky to be hauling your house, a dollhouse, around. And finally, one of the teachers said, "Why are you bringing this to school every day?" I mean, it's one thing to do a show and tell one time, but every day. And she said, "Because we're under demolition order, and I don't want it to be destroyed, and I don't know when they're coming." So it was just
the little girl I remember was the little girl whose home had been demolished, and it had been a 3-story, I believe, 3-story building, for each son, and went way up. And by the time we saw it, there was a cave, just a cave, where a father and family of 7 children lived. And he allowed us to come into the cave, and it's just unfathomable how an entire family could function, go to school, live in that space. And the little girl was so sweet. She was around 6, I think. But she just had a blank look on her face. It was like you could almost not see any happiness coming from her. And what did she have?
Right.
It was just incredible. But the father showed a great deal of resilience. I mean, he wasn't giving up. He was going to fight as best he could to the end.
Yeah. That was in Silwan, which is on the slopes of the old city, and where Israel says the city of David was. So they're now clearing large areas to make a City of David theme park.
And they refer to it as cleansing. We're cleansing the area, which is what the house demolitions are. I mean, it is such a horribly racist concept, and the way they're talking about it again is just shocking. I think that's when I hear that stuff over and over, you know, it just becomes something hard to take, because the contrast to me, as you were speaking, I was thinking of the family we stayed with up in Jenin, and we were there for the olive harvest, and we were all broken up. There were 23 of us in the delegation. We were broken up into different small groups to go stay with independent families, different families, and the family we stayed with had 10 children, and the contrast of children, you know, little twins and whatnot, running around and being so much more joyful, having their house, living in this village. Not that they aren't threatened with whatever, but it's feels less intense than being right in the heart of East Jerusalem, where every day, not that, you know, just that day someone in Jenin, not far from where we were, a young man had been shot, you know, just at the whim of an Israeli soldier. But it was, I don't know, so there was the contrast of the joy of the olive harvest and this cooperative farm, olive farmers, really celebrating and dance and music and song and all the farmers together. It's something you might see in the Midwest, you know, celebrating. Right. So it was that part was really lovely.
And the hospitality, the
hospitality.
Food. It was incredible.
Yeah.
Now, we've been talking about Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank. We also spent time in Israel, within the old Green Line of Israel proper, and we went all the way from Nazareth in the north down to the Negev desert. And in the Negev, we went to one of the 35 unrecognized villages, as they're called, where Bedouin have been living. Bedouin have had their own olive trees, they've had planted citrus trees, they've also had their flocks, sheep, and so on. They are people who were there long before the State of Israel was founded, and they basically have been threatened by the same kind of demolition and displacement that we saw, even though they're citizens of Israel. So maybe one of you would like to describe our visit to Al-Araqib.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was quite remarkable. We were taken there by a woman, an Israeli woman who's been doing solidarity work with the Bedouin. And we got brought there, and the bus parked, and we got off, and there was all sorts of gorgeous carpets laid out under a tree. And this young man, Bedouin man, started to speak to us, and then in came, I don't know what his, if any,
Sheikh Abu Aziz.
Sheikh Abu Aziz. I didn't know if he was related to the young man, is what I was. And they sat down in chairs, and of course they gave us coffee and more coffee, and how about some tea? I mean, it's so wonderful that, you know, they just are so generous with what little they do have. And were telling us the story about how they had been, their houses had been demolished 40 times in the last 3 years. And the only reason that they were able to even still be there is because they were living in a cemetery. And in these incredible makeshift buildings, small little, you know, slap it together with whatever piece of wood and tin roofing you can find, and tent material, very little of it. A lot of destroyed tents up on the open flat land where they had really had some, you know, dwellings, places where that had been destroyed. And so the young man took us on a walk, and two things, major things stood out. One was surrounding this entire area it was forested with eucalyptus trees, which had been recently planted by the Israelis, and they really are trying through the Power Plan, which is a plan that's been devised by them, to clear the Bedouin out and put them in these towns that have absolutely no infrastructure, and it's not how Bedouins live. So, and that was a lot what the sheikh was telling us. But the young man walked us along, and we saw the remnants of all their houses I actually took a shard of tile just to remind myself. And these trees, these eucalyptus trees, there they are in the middle, and they suck up any water. I mean, they grow fast so that they will fill in, because the Israelis want to make a park there. You know, a nice park for the Israelis to come and have a place to
This
be.
is the Jewish National Fund.
Yeah.
Right,
This is the
and
JNF,
but
yeah.
I also believe that we were told that the eucalyptus trees are planted there to hold land
Right.
that will eventually be a settlement. But they put the eucalyptus trees there, so it's territory that will eventually be a settlement. And so not only is it destroying the land, it is an omen. I mean, it's like, we're here and you're not going to be. And eventually
so-
a settlement will be where those trees
Right.
stand.
And we should say that inside Israel, they actually still use the term settlement for Jewish settlements. It's a little different
Right.
from the settlements outside in the occupied territories, which have been declared illegal under international law. But you're right, they're going to displace these Israeli citizens to make way for Jewish. It's all part of the Judaization of the entire land of
I think
Israel.
that was the shocking thing to me. I mean, not shocking that I never knew, but that these were Israeli citizens, and the same as in Nazareth, that Israeli citizens were getting just pushed off their land in the same way as, and then as in Nazareth, they built Nazareth Elite, you know, a whole separate Jewish town right next to Nazareth, and up on the hill again, always having to look down and lording over essentially. But yeah, so I find that just remarkable.
Yeah, that's where the racism really does
It is.
come in. What we heard from people like Jonathan Cook and his wife Sally Azam in Nazareth about how the town of Nazareth has been squeezed and, you know, people displaced. And it's a very similar dynamic, and it's basically this racist motivation.
Yeah.
Even though they have citizenship, they don't have
And
Jewish
nationalism.
nationality.
Exactly.
Nationalism.
So they don't get all the rights. There are, according to the Abdalah, which is a legal organization in Israel proper for so-called, well, Palestinian Israelis or Arab Israelis, whatever term you want to use. There are 50 different laws passed by the Knesset which privilege Jews over Palestinians, even though both have citizenship. So, I mean, there's clearly that kind of
Apartheid.
apartheid, segregation, total within Israel, which, you know,
Yeah.
is not getting better, it's only getting worse. So, with the kinds of laws the Knesset is passing. We did meet some Israelis who
gonna
are
say,
trying to
that
fight.
came into
Would
my
you like
mind as
to
you were-
talk about some
As
of
you were
those?
saying that,
Yeah.
I mean, it was really also heartening, as small a group as they are. It was heartening to meet Israelis who are opposed to the occupation and who are opposed to the colonization. I mean, the laws are so draconian, so Orwellian, so really evil, that to have the Israelis be able to stand up against to their own government and be, you know, so the democracy works for them. They have free speech, not that they probably don't get isolated, as we know people have. The group, the Israeli group, boycott. Well, boycott from within, and that's mainly based on campuses, but also
New profile.
New Profile.
Yeah.
Yeah, where one of the women, not Dorothy Naor, but the woman we met at the dinner, sorry, I've forgotten her name. Anyway, she's been shunned completely because her son refused to be in the military, and she's been just totally shunned in her neighborhood. And I'm sure that goes on for a lot of the Israelis who are active. But we did, so ICAD and the woman who took us in,
Zukrot, the woman who took us down by Lifta, which was a
into Lifta,
Palestinian village
fantastic.
that
I mean,
was ruined.
so we had this wonderful, just 1 second, just this wonderful interchange with Israeli activists, and I felt empathy for them because having been an activist in this country, you often are not shunned, but you're a small group. You know, we're also a small group. So I recognize what they have to come up against, and I really respect them for doing that piece of work.
I was so impressed with the work that New Profile does in trying to demilitarize the system somewhat, because it's become, the schools are very militaristic. We were told that they are now introducing Holocaust material into the kindergartners to make sure that they grow up with that same set of fears and hatred that engenders to see the other as the person who's going to do you in, which is what they're doing to the other people, but to the Palestinians. Also, they are working with young people who are of age to go into the Israeli army who do not want to do it, and helping them figure out how they can resist, and helping people understand that there are alternatives and that they can not serve if it's against their conscience, which it sounds like it's becoming somewhat more frequent to have people resisting the army and not wanting to participate. And I thought that was amazing.
Yeah. It was, to me, very encouraging to meet the boycott from within people, to know there are Israelis, not very many, I mean, they admit it, but still, Israelis who are willing to help with boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, which all over the West Bank, people told us, you have to work on BDS. You have to work on BDS.
That was really encouraging to me, because we've been doing BDS from early on, since the call or just after the call came out from the Palestinian civil organizations. And I felt like, and they've not heard of Jewish Voice for Peace, and so they know that other people have been doing boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and that was like, oh, good. The last few years have not been in total vain, that there's a real rhythm going internationally around this particular approach, a peaceful approach to ending the colonization and the occupation and finding justice for Palestine. I mean, I feel like this is the approach that calling apartheid what it is, and not necessarily making it exactly the same as South Africa. It is not, that is clear, but it is apartheid nonetheless in the legal sense of the definition, and as things are with passes and laws and rules and separation. And so I feel really inspired by their continued feedback, which is continue what you're doing, please, thank you, please do it. And I'm like, yeah, what else? That works for me.
Right. So I saw both of you in a BDS flash mob video on YouTube since you've returned.
We participated in the National Day of boycotting Target through Jewish Voice for Peace.
And SodaStream.
SodaStream. Boycotting Target because they sell SodaStream.
Asking Target to de-shell. We're not boycotting the whole store.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's important to say that.
No, we weren't boycotting Target. We were asking Target.
Maybe you should have got people to boycott, given the
what happened?
The credit card.
Yeah, right. I thought about that. Yeah. So it was exciting. We did a flash mob. We danced and we sang, and there were some interested people who wanted to know why we were taking this action, and I think that it's a great way to go.
Yeah. So if I could just add that SodaStream, which was the target of your
the target of our boycott,
is manufactured in Ma'ale Adumim, which is the largest Israeli settlement, and it's the one that's going to, at some point, if they get their way, basically be stretched as far as Jerusalem, cutting the West Bank in two. And SodaStream is very much a product of that settler mentality. And
Palestinian workers are the people making the product.
Yeah, well,
and they're
for low wages.
They should be working on their land where they belong and doing the work that they love, and not working in a sweatshop.
Yeah.
Or controlling their own factories if they want that.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to just close by saying something about the group we went with and urging people who are watching this perhaps to get in touch with them. It's called Interfaith Peace-Builders. You could contact them at 202-244-0821. I'll just hold this up to the camera. What I think is so outstanding about this group is that they prepare delegations very well on what to expect. Everyone gets together ahead of time for a few days of training, learning about the issues, learning about the culture,
Bonding with each other.
learning about how to get through the airport and how to get out, all of these kinds of training experiences. And then on the return, they provide information how people can be active in getting out the word. And they really encourage this kind of action, because it's no good just going and seeing and coming back and not sharing the message. So I'm really pleased that the two of you have been out there sharing the message. The rest of our delegation is sharing the message. And I hope more and more people will take advantage of the opportunity of going, seeing for themselves, and coming back and really saying, telling their fellow Americans who are paying for this with our tax dollars, that the occupation must end. There must be equality, freedom, and justice for all in Israel, Palestine.
Can I just quickly add, I think having been doing this work for so long but not having been is what it is. But then having gone and coming back, and people saying, well, what have you been doing? And I said, well, I just came back from a 2-week trip to Palestine. I think Interfaith Peace-Builders does run an amazing delegation, I think. Very well run. And anyway, so I was telling people, and I ended up having conversations with people like my neighbor, who I would probably not have raised the issue so much because it just wouldn't come up. But what have you been up to? Did you have a nice trip to Colorado to see my daughter? I said, yes, but then I went. And then, so she said, well, it is amazing that people who have been so downtrodden or had so much against them for many years would do the same to another group. And I'm like, really? I mean, who knew she thought that or knew about it? And so we ended up having this really full-blown discussion. And I mean, it's happened to me many times over, even just in these 6 weeks. So I think I encourage people so much to go and get the understanding from the ground of what really is the situation, and to be able to then say, well, I just went, and people go, oh, really? Well gosh, and so people get.
And the food's so good.
Yeah, that's true.
Food's divine.
Would you agree with what you heard, Susan?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I've broached the subject with a number of people and had great conversations, and hope to have some more chances to speak to people about my experience, and more activities like the flash mob, because that was not only productive, I hope, but it was fun. It definitely changed my life, and this is the work I want to do, and hope to continue it.
Well, terrific, and I thank you both for being on
Thanks.
Arabic Hour.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of us who will be staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdalah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience, the American Arabic Benevolent Association, AABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors, the Nicholas G. Beram Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride, and by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.
الساعة 7:07 أنا بعد من نومي شفاية